It's 40 years since we issued the call over this illegitimate authority.
Not now.
Hello?
Was working.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay. Won't think of any conspiracy theories. The call was mainly written by Mark Raskin, who incidentally sends his regrets that he can't be here today in Washington. I thought at the time that it was quite an appropriate and powerful document. I had some reservations about it and still do. They mainly have to do with the title. When we talk about resisting illegitimate authority, it kind of presupposes that illegitimate authority is somehow an oddity. The norm is legitimate authority, but we shouldn't really be looking at it the other way around. Authority is illegitimate. It has to prove itself, and it very rarely can. But the burden of proof is on authority, not on opposing authority. And that's true in every aspect of life. So I thought the picture was in a way skewed. And it made sense at the time. It was a very different time than now. The idea of resisting authority was pretty much the margin. And when it was there, it wasn't in the sense of challenging institutions. It was mostly kind of a cultural challenge. You want to do things differently, or be a hippie or something like that. But the idea of actually challenging existing institutions and their behavior was pretty remote from consciousness. Nowadays, things look pretty ugly in many ways, but it's well remembered that it looked a lot worse then. 1967 was after pretty much the collapse of the civil rights movement, a huge mass popular movement which was extremely effective, but it ran aground when it addressed the questions of class. As long as it was focused on racist sheriffs in Alabama, you could get a lot of mainstream support. But when it began to hit privilege and power, it quickly ran aground. I'm sure that Martin Luther King was assassinated when he was planning to lead a people's movement. That was not acceptable. So the civil rights movement was had pretty well disappeared. It was barely the beginnings of a feminist movement. There was no environmental movement, issues like gay rights that we were talking about. There was today, as Laura said, there's concern about things like extending wiretapping. But at the time, repression was far more severe. There's nothing now like COINTELPRO, for example. A major government operation ran through 4 administrations, mainly Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, which was carried out by the National Political Police, the FBI, targeting just about everybody. Were the Nationalist Workers' Party, the women's movement, all the black movements, the entire new left, and it was pretty severe. One of the memorable, unfortunately unforgettable, early moments in Resist was when a couple of board members flew to Chicago in 1969 to just be present at the funeral for Fred Hampton, the black organizer who was assassinated in a literal Gestapo-style assassination set up by the FBI and implemented by the Chicago police. Actually, I had planned to, on returning that night, next morning, to have a meeting at MIT about it, and actually we arranged for the biggest auditorium at MIT. I figured there would be a big crowd out for that. It was a tiny scatter of people. Most people didn't know, others didn't care. The black organizer was assassinated by the national political police. That's only one of many incidents, the worst. The repression was severe. There was a war going on, but and in fact, resist itself was focused primarily on resistance to the war. The Cobra resist was not the first step. In 1965, a number of us, including some people I see here, tried to organize national tax resistance, which was a middling success, didn't get very far. The war itself had already been going on for years with it. I mean, there was so little protest that people don't even remember when it started as an actual war, not just repression and subversion and so on. That was 1962, when Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, initiated a chemical warfare program to destroy crops, livestock, ground cover, began programs to drive ultimately millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps, where they were surrounded by barbed wire was put to protect them from the guerrillas, the indigenous guerrillas, who was conceded they were willingly supported. Now, that's a major war. And by 1965, the war had in fact expanded. It was starting to dominate Vietnam. But even then, protest was very limited. I just I don't recommend this, but for my sins, I just read Arthur Schlesinger's journals, which recently appeared. If you look further, during the years when he was really part of the government, in fact, he was the left-wing conscience of the government during the Kennedy years. There's page about one of the parties he went to, pushed into the swimming pool, and how beautiful Jackie was, and so on and so forth. There was literally not one word about Vietnam. The word doesn't appear. Just wasn't happening. And that was the general attitude and consciousness. The first major public protest against the war was October 1965, the first International Day of Protest. I mean, you'll probably remember it. We did have a demonstration at Boston Common, a rally at Boston Common around the rally intended to. It was just broken up violently by students, among others. You couldn't hear a word any of the speaker was saying. If you listened to the radio that day, at the Wilson Globe the next day, it was full of bitter denunciations of people who dared to issue embarrassingly mild protests against the war. The protests then were mostly against the bombing of North Vietnam, which was been enough of a sideshow. The main attack was against South Vietnam, always was. Well, things have changed to some extent. In this morning's Boston Globe, you can read a milder criticism which says that we should do nothing to imperil the mission of our forces in Iraq. That's supposed to be, that's criticism of the far left. But things have changed a bit. Around the time the resist was formed, there was beginning to be some public criticism apart from grassroots activists. So Arthur Schlesinger again wrote what's probably the first, regarded as the first book critical of the war, the heritage, in which he did oppose the war in Vietnam, but on interesting grounds, which will sound very familiar today. He was having a debate with his close friend Joseph Alsop, a super Paul. Alsop argued that if we send more troops, we can win. Translate the surge. Schlesinger argued that he said, we all pray that Mr. Alsop will be right. And if he is, and if we can win, we will be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in a land of ruin and wreck, as he described it. But it's unlikely that it will work. Hard to translate that bill today. Some things haven't changed much in the elite culture. That was these were the conservative, in 1967, there were some people who really cared, like Bernard Fall, the military historian and Vietnam specialist, who was no doubt incidentally. He was killed in combat in 1967, attempting combat, and just before his death, he wrote his last reflections on a war, in which he said that he wondered whether Vietnam, and it's mainly South Vietnam, would survive as a cultural and historical entity under the attack of the largest military force ever launched against an area that size. Now that was those were the facts. The attitude at home was quite different. In this respect, things have changed notably. Let's shift till today. Today, the notion of resisting authority is not an unimaginable notion. In fact, it's a common notion. Laura mentioned it, maybe by accident, used for remarks at an island. Because resisting authority makes sense. Authority is not legitimate unless it proves itself, which it really can do. And the circumstances are quite different now. In many ways, much improved. Repression may be wiretapping, but it's not political assassination and mass efforts of political police to destroy any popular movement, serious effort. There's a war, terrible war, but it's not 500,000 troops and 60,000 or 70,000 free-time mercenaries wiping out South Vietnam and then going on later to destroy most of the rest of Indochina. And there's protest against it. Unlike Vietnam, the Iraq War is the first one in the history of Western imperialism, as far as I can recall, where there was mass popular protest before the war was even officially launched. And it continues, not at a level that I'd like to see, but way beyond the level of any comparable stage of the Vietnam War. Concern about repression is widespread, not focused. COINTELPRO, horrible as it was, of course, the assassination of Fred Hampton, never even arose during the Watergate hearings. It was pretty remarkable because the information about it leaked out at the same time as Watergate, not from the press. No, Rupert Bernstein came out of court hearings, but the information was there. It just nobody cared. Watergate was a Tea Party by comparison. I don't think anything like that is possible now, because there are changes in consciousness and awareness. The situation now, I think, is one in which we can think seriously about resisting authority across a broad spectrum. And in many ways, it shouldn't be that hard. Take a look at the country now. I think it's, in my sense, around is pretty much the way Laura described it. I suspect if you counted noses, there's much more activism now than there was in the 60s. It's separated, atomized, small groups, unified, but it's there. And in fact, we can see even in intensive studies of public opinion how deep it is. And by now, both political parties are way to the right of the population on a host of major issues, crucial issues, which means that there is a basis for organizing resistance to authority that shouldn't exist. Just to take two, and I'll finish with that. One of the main, maybe the main international issue that's coming along is a possible U.S. invasion of Iran, which takes place when they Iraq with the British military historian, Robert Barnett, just wrote that if it happens, we'll be in World War III. Well, more about that, but it'll be extremely ugly. What do the American people think about it? Well, interesting. There have been intensive polls of Iranians and Americans by the same institution, and they basically agree. They agree on a reasonable settlement of Iran-U.S. conflict. The overwhelming majority, so 75 to 80%, agree that Iran should, in both countries, that Iran has a right to nuclear power as a sign of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but should not have nuclear weapons. By the same overwhelming majority, Americans and Iranians agree that the whole region should be a weapons-free zone, nuclear weapons-free zone. That includes Iran, Israel, and any American forces deployed there. Even higher percent of Americans, over 80%, believe that the United States should live up to its requirement, actually legal requirement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and move to eliminate all its nuclear weapons. But the same percentage think there should be no threats against Iran, just entering into normal relations. Well, that's the population. You can't find a viable candidate, but that's the percentage of the viable candidates. Every one of them says we should continue with the threats of war against Iran. Meaning all options are on the table. Anybody cares? The threats themselves are major violations of international law. UN Charter rules bars any threat or use of force. But that's okay. We can all be criminals. That's the political class. That's the discussion in the media, and so on. It's not the population. The population is there, can be organized. And the same is true of confronting the system of corporate power at home. Something that was almost unimaginable in the 1960s, but is taking place now in many ways. And in fact, it arises very clearly on what has long been the main domestic issue in the United States for the population. For very good reasons, which I don't bother talking about. The main concern of people at home here for a long time has been the healthcare system, which is a catastrophe. And they have opinions about it. Like a large majority of the population for decades has been in favor of national health care. Something like extending, say, Medicare to the whole population, which would be far more efficient. But that has never even arisen in a political campaign. As recently as 2004, it was even mentioned it was both politically impossible, meaning it doesn't matter how much the population wants it, the insurance companies are against it, the pharmaceutical companies are against it, so it's politically impossible. Well, that's not true, but by now there's enough popular pressure and other reasons so that candidates have to at least say something about it. Not the right things, but something. There's again a population ready to be organized, they're ready to understand that the issue is not just a rotten healthcare system, but it's corporate control of the rotten healthcare system, which makes it that way, and that takes us right to the heart of authority, which is considered legitimate, but we should consider illegitimate.